Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel Lighting the Knowledge Candle. As of today, we will be discussing about the topics of community medicine discussed in first aid. Later, we will be clubbing and annotating these discussions with previous year questions and coaching notes. Ultimately, coaching notes will be our last source to revise in the last 1 month or 10 days before exam because our target is neet PG or inicet. It's not USMLE. So coaching notes will be the ultimate source. After adding the previous year questions to the notes, we'll be adding only those extra topics discussed in the first aid that were actually asked previous years in inicet or neet. Today we are going to discuss about the observational studies as they were discussed initially in the first aid. Observational studies include case series, cross-sectional study, case control study, cohort study, twin concordance study, adoption study, ecological study. We might have heard and studied about the case series, cross-sectional, case control, cohort study, and even ecological study. Twin concordance study and adoption study are the new things we are hearing today. As of they are specifically discussed in first aid, not discussed in our coaching notes. Let's discuss each study in detail. First, case series. Case series describes several individual patients with same diagnosis, treatment, or outcome. Measures of case series include description or we can say elucidation of signs and symptoms. In the observational study case series, we cannot show risk factor or association with the disease as it has no comparison of the group. That is, I would like to say in the case series, we cannot show risk factor association with the disease because it has no comparison group. That's all about the case series discussed here. Next comes cross-sectional study. In the cross-sectional study, we choose a set of people and we assess frequency of the disease and frequency of risk-related factors in them. It just asks the question to the set of population, what is happening in the set of population. The cross-sectional study aids in knowing the prevalence of a disease. It's the key word to be remembered here. That is, the prevalence of the disease would be known by the cross-sectional study. It can be asked as an MCQ. It can show risk factor association with the disease, which was a drawback in case series, but does not establish causality. That's the cause of the disease cannot be established in the cross-sectional study. Next, we would be discussing about case control study. Case control study, the first point we have to remember is effect to cause. It moves from effect to cause. That is, we will be moving from the diseased persons. In case control study, we move from disease to risk factor. This study retrospectively compares a group of people with disease to a group without disease. Looks to see if odds of prior exposure or risk factor differ by disease state. It asks the question, what happened that you have got this disease? It moves from disease to the risk factor. The measures of the case control study is odds ratio. In order to elucidate the case control study, we use something called as odds ratio. In order to explain with an example, patient with COPD had higher odds of smoking history than those people without COPD. Next, we will discuss about cohort study. Cohort study, it goes from cause to effect, like the reversal of the case control study. It compares a group with a given exposure or risk factor to a group without such exposure. Looks to see if exposure or risk factor is associated with later development of disease. Cohort study can be prospective or retrospective. No matter whether the study is prospective or retrospective, risk factor has to be present prior to the disease of development. We do review of previous records and move from risk factor to disease incidence in retrospective cohort study. We had a question on retrospective cohort study in the recent NEET PG 2023. So, in measures of cohort study, we understand it gives an idea of disease incidence and relative risk. To speak with an example, people who smoke has a higher risk of developing COPD than people who do not. Next comes the twin concordance study. It compares the frequency with which both monozygotic twins versus dizygotic twins develop the same disease. It measures heritability and influence of environmental factors, that is, nature versus nurture. Next comes the adoption study, compares behavioral traits or genetics in siblings raised by biological parents versus adoptive parents. It also measures heritability and influence of environmental factors. Next comes the ecological study. Ecological study compares frequency of disease and frequency of risk related factors across populations, or we can say frequency of risk related factors across environments. It measures population data not necessarily applicable to individuals, which can be termed as ecological fallacy. That is, the data cannot be applicable to individuals. It is applicable only for a specific set of population. It is used to monitor the entire population health. For an example, in order to quote with an example, we can say COPD prevalence was higher in more polluted cities. That's our end to the summary of observational studies in epidemiological studies. Thank you.